You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyi with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed here as one of our associate producers with a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly Patreon subscription of $5 or more, you can join our meetings of the Hive Mind on the second Saturday of each month. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is the 15th Amendment. With this episode, we'll finish our brief look at the Reconstruction Amendments. If you want to learn more, I highly recommend Eric Foner's Second Founding and Heather Cox Richardson's How the South Won the Civil War, both of which are available through your favorite independent bookseller. The last of the Reconstruction Amendments is the 15th. This was created to fix the deficiencies perceived in the voting rights section of the 14th Amendment. Yes, the 14th Amendment established that a state would lose part of its federal representation if it prevented citizen men over the age of 21 from voting, but it did not actively and positively assure a right to vote for African American men. The discussion about such an amendment started as soon as the 14th Amendment had been passed, but the election of 1868 exemplified the need for it. The Democrats campaigned on a platform of returning white rule to the South, and Republicans campaigned on not allowing that to happen. Republicans also shied away from making the enfranchisement of blacks part of their platform, for fear it would lose them white votes. However, the very thin margin of Ulysses S. Grant's win of the presidency, along with the amount and types of voter suppression seen over the course of that election, convinced the party it was worth the potential losses. There were two options for the format of the amendment. The first had affirmative language that established a federal standard for those who could vote, thereby generally outlawing any attempts at disenfranchisement. The second would cite specific criteria which could not be used to prevent someone from voting, such as race, but left the overall criteria for determining who was eligible to vote to the states, as had been established in the original Constitution. This left massive loopholes for voter suppression which are still seen in the 21st century. The issue of removing the power to determine voters from the states was one major reason why the affirmative language was not used. Even the most adamant supporters thought that would prevent ratification. The second reason was a combination of racism and nationalism. Even radical Republicans expressed concern about allowing immigrants to vote, particularly the Chinese and the Irish. It was one thing to allow the formerly enslaved to vote. They, at least, had been born in the United States. But to open it to immigrants created a potential for foreign influence or rule by, quote, impoverished and criminal classes. They were concerned that immigrants would cause the American government to become socialist by electing people who promised them money or other benefits. This fear was very soon also applied to black voters and was the beginning of the American fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of socialism. Debate over the wording of the amendment, particularly how extensive the list of prohibited types of disenfranchisement should be, and its scope, whether it should include a right to hold office in addition to the right to vote, continued through the early part of 1869. In the end, it outlawed only racial restrictions in voting because that was the most likely route to ratification and addressed directly the group who had prompted the need. It was approved in the House and the Senate in March of 1869 with the following wording, quote, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." It is followed, like the other Reconstruction Amendments, with the statement, "Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation." There was no question among those involved that this was weak and left far too much room for other methods of disenfranchisement. Because of this, it relied on the enforcement of Section 2 of the 14th Amendment to have any real effect, a reliance that proved unfulfilled. The 15th Amendment was ratified as of the end of March of 1870, sweeping away all laws that had limited the vote to white men across the United States. As with the 14th Amendment, women's suffrage advocates were disappointed. While it did not specify men this time, it did nothing to enfranchise women. This encouraged the suffragists to focus on state-level laws, where they found the successes from which they could build toward the federal amendment, which was ratified in 1920. For all of its inadequacies, the 15th Amendment was still a radical and important step toward equality. Alongside the other Reconstruction Amendments, it serves to reassert the ideals of equality and democracy on which the United States claims to be founded and attempts to demonstrate for the rest of the world. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagys Patreon patrons, Patty, Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck, Laura Dull, Chris Hill, Betty Larson, and Vince Lott. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. We'd love it if you could help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagys. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome chart and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter and Blue Sky at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on the socials at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?